Not long ago, we dreamt the Bible. From deep within our several and collective unconsciousnesses, we brought it forth. Twisted, convoluted, and mysterious, but nevertheless true beyond our wildest dreams. Unable to withstand the going up from our depths, enough to remain in simple pshat form, it cloaked itself in mystery, transformed intolerable desires into dense imagery and words, deleted the good parts, substituting them with parts that seemed good. Now all that we have left is the piously handed down scroll, filled with square black letters, the spaces between them, and of course our own fragmented memories of a dream.
Shalom. Welcome to Hayom. I'm Rabbi Arnold Rachlis. Normally when we think about mysticism, we might think about other religious traditions, not Judaism. Or if we think of Judaism, we think of Hasidism, a part of Orthodoxy. But our guest today, whom you've just heard, has brought mysticism to the core of liberal Judaism, has helped American Jews, not Orthodox, American Jews, suburban Jews, Jews who think of mysticism as something very esoteric, has brought mysticism to the core of their form of Judaism. Our guest is Rabbi Lawrence Kushner of Temple Bethel in Sudbury, Massachusetts. He's written a number of books. The most recent is The River of Light. It's titled Spirituality, Judaism, and the Evolution of Consciousness. Larry, welcome to the show.
It's good to be here.
What is spirituality, Judaism, and the evolution of consciousness? How do they go together?
The best way to talk about spirituality, Arnie, for me, is to go back to a time when I sat with a group of kids in our religious school and asked them if they believed in God. And none of them believed in God. I asked them to raise their hand. Not one of them raised their hand. And I was crushed, destroyed, saddened. And later on, it occurred to me to ask them if any of them had ever been close to God. And everybody raised their hand. And it was then that I realized that the old language for do you or do you not believe in God, and are you or are you not a religious person, was no longer meaningful to a new generation. But asking kids instead, had they been close to God, was something to which they could all respond.
And how do they describe being close to God?
They ticked off what you and I would call, what us closet spiritual seekers would call the experience. They would say, last Shabbos when we lit Shabbos candles. Last year when Grandpa died and I was angry and frightened, but I knew I was close. On Yom Kippur, when I was helping my father, he wanted me to help him, I didn't want to help him. I mean, they talked about the little moments of being close to the Holy One of Being. Moments which I think probably everyone out there has countless times in each one of their days.
Let's talk about the phrase Holy One of Being. In your prayer book, you use that phrase instead of God. Why do you use that substitution? What's important about not using the term God for you?
I think that the word God has become religious duck speak. People use it blah blah and it doesn't mean anything. It's been so overused that it's no longer able to evoke a sense of the mystery and the holiness. And I suspect that each generation has to find its own name for God, and I've nominated one that works for me. There's a sense of a holy unity to all of being, and that when I do business with the Holy One of Being, that's about as close as I could understand to what I think my grandparents meant when they talked about talking to God.
Do you think American Jews are afraid of mysticism? I mean, 19th century and 18th century enlightened Jews, Maskilim, sort of wrote mysticism out of the tradition. And certainly early Reform Judaism thought of it as obscurantist and antiquarian. But there seems to be a healthy curiosity, almost a playing with mysticism among liberal American Jews today. What do you think accounts for that?
I'm reminded of a story that comes to us in the name of the Baal Shem Tov. Briefly, once there was a king. He wanted the people should be close to him, but he knew if he made it too easy that they'd give up the search. And so the king decided to build a castle, but he was a master at illusions, said the Baal Shem Tov, and that he built the castle with illusory doors and illusory gates and illusory moats and illusory windows, and then he told the people to come and be close. And one by one, when they came to the castle to be close to the king, they realized that it would be very hard, even though it wasn't, because the castle looked almost impregnable. And they discovered that there were doors and moats and gates, and they gave up the search until one searcher came and said, this is a beautiful castle, but it won't keep me away from my goal of trying to be close to the king. And discovered that the door wasn't there, and the moat wasn't there, and the wall wasn't there, and that indeed the world as it is presented to us by our senses is very often only a shell of something that lies within, and that I guess as a young student of the Jewish mystical tradition, I get to claim that there's more to reality than meets the eye. There's a holy oneness to all of being.
Do you think a traditionalist might say, that's not God, or that's not the Jewish version of God, that's sort of narcissistic, enlightened, sort of a narcissistic search for enlightenment or transcendence, and it's too much like the trend towards Eastern religions that went on 15 and 20 years ago, or it's too much like Est or humanistic psychology gobbledygook. Can you imagine traditionalists saying that?
They have.
Okay. And how do you respond to that?
What I say to them is that I'm willing to take them point by point, and that it's all there in the tradition. It's all there beautifully laid out, and that the only thing we suffer from is having been handed a tradition of Jewish spirituality that has been gone over with a meat cleaver, and that all that remains is, the best example is that I was raised in a quality liberal Jewish Sunday school. I went through high school, and the word Kabbalah was never mentioned. Now, if you contrast that with the remark of Gershom Scholem, Oliver Scholem, who said that for about 6 centuries, the Zohar, the central document of Jewish mysticism, was more important and more well known by the average Jew on the street than the Talmud, then we have to assume that the way we were told and what we were told was Jewish history and tradition was indeed not the whole truth.
Well, do you think that traditional Jews are afraid of mysticism, that it's easier to deal with halachot individually, to deal with mitzvot and individual Jewish behavior, to stick to that kind of pattern, rather than deal with the kind of power of mysticism, a Judaism without rules in some ways?
You know, I don't like to get into saying, nah, I know the right way, you don't. I'm too shaky as a believer to be able to throw stones at anyone else's glass stiebel. I would much rather say, look, this is what works for me. This is an accurate account of the holiness that I find. I find it adequately and thoroughly described in Jewish tradition, and that if other people are able to get close to God and do mitzvahs with another God idea, mazel tov.
Do you think, though, that just by its very nature, mysticism puts people off because it demands something other than rule following? I mean, in some ways, although being a halachic Jew is difficult because there's so much you have to follow, there is a sort of an ease once you accept, the Ol Malchut Shamayim, sure, the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. Once you accept that, you have a pattern. Mysticism is like going across a terrain, a very beautiful terrain, without a map, in some ways.
I think that all varieties of mysticism are in one sense heretical, because they return to the individual a sense of spiritual power over their own religious life. They say to you, if you're going to be a mystic, I say, presto, Rabbi Rachlis, you are now in charge of your own life, and you don't have to rely on what anybody else tells you is religious reality. And so for that reason, mysticism always starts to crop up, is often called a heresy, at times when Jewish religious life seems to be at its most sterile, staid, dull, best, or worse. And I think we live in times like that. And I think that the appearance of neo-Hasidic varieties of within liberal Judaism, and a guy like me who wasn't raised in a yeshiva, but who grew up playing baseball in Northwest Detroit, to be able to speak about mysticism is an indication that the great old tradition is about to give birth to yet a new formulation. And I have no idea what that will be. All I can do is report the truth as I encounter it.
Larry, how did you happen to come to Jewish mysticism? I mean, you're a good Jewish boy, a Reform Jew, a Reform rabbi, a graduate of Hebrew Union College, someone who would not have had mysticism in their background. What attracted you to Jewish mysticism?
It's always seemed to me that the fundamental touchstone for all religiosity, I mean, since I was very young, and I have a hard time understanding why not everybody agrees with me, although I'm grown up enough to understand that they don't, was God. And I kept asking questions about God all the time, and that I didn't find answers that I found satisfying. But yet I found in the writings of Jewish spiritual seekers and quasi-mystical and Kabbalistic types answers that seemed to me to be much more seriously talking about the nature of ultimate meaning in life. And when you talk about God, I think that's what you're talking about. And too many Jews out there have given up talking about God seriously. They talk about God, to paraphrase one of my teachers, Gene Borowitz, in third grade Sunday school language, and never grew beyond that.
Do you think they're afraid to go beyond that? A lot of American Judaism, especially this return to observance among more liberal Jews, seems to be for purposes that are aesthetic or familial. You know, you do it because it's pretty, it's nice. A Havdalah candle brings warmth into a house, or sitting around a Shabbos table makes families feel good about each other. And I wouldn't in any way devalue those reasons. I think they're important reasons for observance. But do you think that's the level on which American Jews want to embrace Judaism, rather than something much more serious like intellectual study or some kind of dveikut, some kind of commitment?
No, I think it's even more than that.
Okay.
I mean, I think there are obviously people who are swept along in the tide, in the zeitgeist, but there is a profound hungering on the part of our people to find a renewed sense of ultimate meaning for their lives. I think it was shattered by the Holocaust, and that is precious as Israel is to us, it is now also clear that that cannot be a surrogate for our own indigenous spirituality. We must begin to find things in the tradition and within ourselves that will help us make that happen. We do that by telling one another the truth about a lot of the platitudes that we've mouthed, and breaking a couple of the vessels, to use a Kabbalistic image, that sometimes need to be broken.
You use storytelling in your synagogue. That's very unusual. What do you think it is about stories that convey meaning that you want to use them in the liturgy, to blend them into the ongoing life of the liturgy? Is that right?
Yes.
Why?
I believe that all searches for ultimate meaning and lookings after God, to allude to what we said earlier, have to begin, in order to be credible, from the lived life of individual, ordinary human beings like you and I. People who don't fly to heaven every night, people whose hair hasn't turned white and who don't hear Handel's Hallelujah Chorus on the way to work, but people who just go to work in the morning, come home in the evening, try to eat meals, and that in that ordinary everyday life are high, holy, beautiful moments. And that what we have to learn to do is tell about them to one another. And the way we do that is by reviving the narrative. In every spiritual revival that Judaism, to my knowledge, or any other religion, as far as I could surmise, has known, has always been preceded by a renewal of the narrative. All of a sudden, I mean, the best example are all the stories about the Hasidic Rabbis. Well, we have to learn how to tell spiritual stories about our lives to one another.
Storytelling is only one of the many innovations you've brought to Temple Bethel in Sudbury. It's a very interesting kind of place. Can you tell us a little bit about it? What kinds of things you do liturgically that are innovative? What kinds of people there are there?
Yeah, I think that the most important thing to say about it, before I say a little bit about the programming, is a nice way to tie into the earlier part of what we were saying. The synagogue is based upon a religious premise, and that is that the religious experience and knowledge or lack of knowledge of all of the members of the congregation is valid and worthy of serious consideration. So we pay close attention to what people say and think who everybody suspects don't know so much. And in doing that, they discover they have to learn more, speak as wisely as they can, challenge one another, and produce some lovely things. So what we've come up with, for example, was that we started talking to one another about the liturgy. We discovered that the siddur that we used was inadequate to describe the spiritual reality we all met. People didn't believe God was a man. They didn't believe God was a woman either. So what we did was we created a liturgy. We published a prayer book. It's now in its second edition and fourth printing, which I believe is the only non-sexist liturgy that any congregation has produced. The ritual committee has complete power over what happens in the congregation. They listen to me and then they do what they want. And I think there aren't many places that work on that model, and our congregation is marked by the absence of any tension between I and the ritual. They know that it's their congregation and that I trust them and that they'll do what they have to do to make their congregation.
But is your role really that passive? I mean, are you just an advisor or a resource person, or do you really have a very strong hand in the direction of the religious life?
There's a difference between real power and real influence. I would contend I have no real power and want none. I have a lot of influence over some people, and other people couldn't care less what I thought.
Well, then let's take a second to differentiate. What do you mean by power, and what do you mean by influence?
I think influence means that people are willing to listen to you and take you seriously. Power means you can make them do what you want them to do, whether or not they agree with you.
Has anything ever happened in the congregation that you feel very strongly about and negatively about?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of dumb things. I mean, I think that the congregation ought to run a kiddush every Shabbos after the bar mitzvahs instead of asking the families to throw it. And I feel passionately about it and have preached on it for 3 Rosh Hashanahs, and they still won't do it. And that they don't have to do it, because that's the way the deal works.
How about liturgically? Did they want to put certain things in the prayer book that you opposed, or in the sort of the format of services?
I refused to look at the prayer book until it was done.
I mean, you had no hand in it.
I had no, and I went to the second meeting by mutual agreement with the ritual chair people, and I made a speech. I talked for about an hour, and the gist of it was, whatever you do, you should tell one another and God the truth. And they thanked me very much when I left. And they worked for 2 years and came up with the prayer book. It's called V'tahir Libenu. And it's an extraordinary piece of work.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's got a lot of things in it that probably I would have said were terrible to put in. It turned out to be wonderful.
How do your members put together the Hebrew parts of the service? How do they translate them? Are they Hebraically fluent, or do they paraphrase or poeticize existing translations? How are they able to put together a Hebrew prayer book?
The model we have for Hebrew is that there's 2 kinds of Jews. There are Jews who don't know Hebrew and don't want to and never will, and those who don't know much but want to learn more. And that I only do business with Jews who want to learn some Hebrew, even if they're only learning 1 letter a year. Once people have made the decision that they're going to be learning Hebrew, it's amazing to find how much Hebrew they will tolerate in their service.
And how about the translations of the prayers? Who prepared those translations?
Members did them themselves. Sometimes they are inspired, sometimes they are less than sophisticated.
Was it based on a thorough knowledge of the Hebrew, or was it based on a paraphrasing or poeticizing of existing translations?
It was based on intelligent, sophisticated, savvy people, some of whom knew a lot of Hebrew, some of whom didn't know much at all, sitting down and realizing that the rabbi would under no circumstances do it for them. And because that forced them to summon their finest creative abilities, what they came up with was an extraordinary piece of work.
Was this congregation like this before you came, or is this a sort of a function of your giving them freedom?
We don't have a control in the experiment because I was the first full-time rabbi. So when I came, it was very small and not very well organized. And so I and the congregation have been part of an ongoing organic process. But they now regard the model of of their ability to make religious decisions for themselves as a rabbi-given right.
Well, the format that you use in services is very interesting. I don't know if you use it all the time or some of the time, but
Always.
you always sit around tables.
Yeah, we discovered that on Friday nights, being a Reform congregation, our major service is on Friday night, and that we found that the architectural seating model for Jews on Friday nights in most Reform congregations around the country works better on Shabbos morning, and that on Friday night everybody's physical body space was much more into sitting around a table and making little crumbs with the challah that you just ate.
Well, of course, traditionally that's what Friday night is.
Right, and so what we do is services, instead of being on the model of a Saturday morning, sit down in pews and hear the liturgy read, are, come, we'll sit around the table. It's a continuation of the Sabbath table that you all just left. So we, for the past 8 or 9 years, have had services set up around one huge table. We put 6 tables together with a big tablecloth and concentric rows of chairs around it, and a lot of people come. We don't advertise sermon titles, we don't have birthday blessings, Sabbath, and we don't have inauguration and installation. Shabbos, every Shabbos is brought to you by God in honor of Shabbos, that's it. And we probably get what I think most people would call an extraordinarily high attendance.
What's the format of praying in your synagogue? I mean, how do you integrate words, spoken words, storytelling words, readings, and davening?
A lot of give and take.
Yeah.
It's more like a seder than a service. There's a lot of people with books reading. We don't stand up too much until we get to the Amida, and then everybody stands up, wanders till they ever find the place in the room that they feel the most religiously comfortable in, and they pray from there that way. We sit back down. I'll preach. It's rare that I can get through a sermon or Devar Torah without somebody raising their hand or making a comment. The model is teaching learning instead of shut up and listen to me.
Well, what kinds of learning do you do? Lots of synagogues do the latest movie, you know, one sermon on Sophie's Choice, the next sermon on The Chosen, another one on a book.
It's interesting. I'm personally highly committed to religious and political action. I've served as a member of the executive of the Social Action Commission of Reform Judaism, and even have a police record for some nonviolent, civilly disobedient demonstrations. I preach social action sermons and political sermons once or twice a year. Just about all the time we study holy texts. We read aloud, talk about them. Those discussions often lead to contemporary political discussions, but it's very, very rare that we do anything other than read and study and talk about classical religious texts.
You also have in the synagogue a tzedakah collective, which has why don't you tell us what tzedakah collectives are? We'll start that way. Yeah.
Well, at our congregation, at Tzedakah Collective, is a group of members of the congregation who anonymously or secretly pool 2% of their gross income to a common fund, and they get together about 4 times a year to decide how to divide up the amount of money that's there. For fairly affluent suburban Jews, 2% of your gross income is big bucks. Could be a lot bigger, but I mean, we wanted the amount of money to be a serious chunk out of people's income. We then get together, and everyone is given 100 votes. And there's a ballot that's prepared by subcommittees, which lists all the possible recipients for our charitable dollars. And people will speak to and ask questions about all the items on the ballot. We'll talk about how much ought to go to Israel, how much ought to go to education in America, and so forth and so on, in much the same way that the Social Planning and Allocations Committee of any federation would do. And then we vote. The interesting thing is that after we get to divide up our 100 votes any way we want among the items on the ballot, we then have a second, third, and fourth ballots until everyone is satisfied that they, through allocating their votes, has had the maximum possible impact on the voting. So Kushner, who might have had $1,000 to give to 5 charities, now has $20,000 to give to 20 charities, and can somehow feel that I'm directly part of that response.
Do you think people are contributing to the Tzedakah Collective in lieu of more established charities, or this is supplemental to their ongoing normative giving?
I think for some it's one, and for some it's yes, and for others it's no. I think the key thing about it is, and the message that that already organized Jewish philanthropy has begun to hear seriously, and that's the only way in which it is meant, obviously, is that people want to be more involved in where their charitable dollars go. And that's a precious and indispensable part of the tzedakah process for Jews, and that we see ourselves, I think, as part of that greater process in the United States and the world today.
How about non-financial tzedakah, gemilut chasadim, good interpersonal behavior? How does that go on in the congregation? If there's a death, do people go to the Shiva home? Do they prepare?
We've set up a Chevra Kadisha. It's kind of seems like an anachronism for a liberal suburban congregation, but we have a group of people in the congregation. They've operated now for about a half a dozen years, whose job is to be responsible for all aspects of death, burial, and mourning in the congregation, including sitting with the corpse. So we work with a local funeral home, and they help us prepare the body, but the minute the body is prepared, members of the Chevra Kadisha, members of the congregation, sit with the body until the funeral. They've prepared their own funeral prayer book for use at the House of Mourning, and supervise the funeral. If a member of the congregation would like, you sit next to somebody and he's a member of the Chevra, and you say, my God, that man is going to sit by my body when I die. That man is going to, if I want, drive my widow and my children in his car to the funeral, if they want. That man will see to it that no longer will death be something taken care of by well-meaning, white-coated, distant professionals, but also, with their help, by ordinary Jews.
Is your kind of synagogue a new model for synagogue life? We're used to large urban or suburban synagogues with hundreds of members, and it wasn't that way in Europe, where synagogues were small, people knew each other, they were face-to-face communities. Are you going back to a much earlier European model to create a new prototype for a synagogue for contemporary America?
I think that it's important to note in responding, first of all, that it's not a function of size. I think that large congregations can be intimate, healthy, and vibrant, and little ones can be cold, sterile, and inflexible. The model that we're working on, in addition to empowering Jews to do what they want with their religious lives and letting rabbis let go of some of that cherished power that we seem to be endemically, by virtue of our profession, desperately in so much need of, is one that has places a high level of importance on religious tolerance and mutual trust, and on the willingness of one another to say, look, I'm not sure what God wants for you. I'm certainly not sure what God might even want for me.
I want to thank our guest, Rabbi Larry Kushner, for being with us, and I want to show you his book, The River of Light. He also has two other books. I urge you to go to Jewish bookstores, general bookstores, to get his book. He's a very interesting and important figure in American Jewish life, and I know we're going to hear a lot more from him. Please join us again soon on Hayom.